Hey, welcome to Friday night's video. If you watched the previous videos, we've been really focused on resolving to help you, especially helpful to the intermediate and beginners that just want to play that may not be advanced theorists, and to try to help them to do simple things. And the biggest focus on that is try to keep it simple. Play within your means. I mean, try to, so it sounds good. Don't try to make it really extravagant or too much going on. To be able to have fun without having to, get too deep into the theory, which we will later on. But today I wanted the video today. We talked about resolving. We started out, we were talking about leads. And the reason why I talked about leads is because rarely do I get a guitarist that wants to talk to me about rhythm progressions. By the time they actually understand a progression, that they're normally really simple progressions. And by the time they actually start doing some leads, then all of a sudden their improvisation progressions and things like that start to become more important because of the complexity of their playing. So we kind of went full circle, and actually we kind of went a little bit backwards, but not exactly backwards, and we're back to chords and chordal progressions. So I wanted to talk really simply. People get really wrapped up in scales and modes and things like that. And to be honest with you, I'm going to go through scales and modes with you, what I think that every basic and beginning and intermediate guitarist should learn, and the chords that they should learn. Anything above that is going to go to advanced theory. And we'll talk about that. But for now, what I want to talk about is creating chord progressions that resolve. We've been talking a lot about resolve because, like I said, I find a lot of intermediate beginners or even advanced players, the simple concept of just making it resolved normally opens up so many doors for them that they all of a sudden there's this whole new world that answers a lot of questions that they may have as they're playing. And they're trying to figure out where's it resolving to. All of a sudden that question becomes really important. And as they figure out where it's resolving to with the underlying chord and what else is going on, then it starts to really make sense what's happening there, because they're seeing what it's resolving to if they start to look at what's happening there. So I don't want to get into that too much. So if you followed the videos so far, any of the previous videos are on this page. If not, PM me and I'll get you a copy of the video or something like that, or help you try to find it. I hope that the moderators are filing it somewhere, like archived. I'm not sure if the Facebook page has videos that have been presented or anything like that, but if they haven't, maybe they could look into that so it's easy for the reference. But we're going to talk about chordal progressions and resolving. Because if you remember in the first video, we were talking about resolving the leads back to one of the tonal notes of the underlying chord. And then we moved forward into resolving forward by using one of the notes in the chord to be the leading tone to move forward, or using one of the notes in that chord to build the next chord. Those are huge tools. So we we kept going along in that line. Then we talked a little bit more about improvisation and resolving in improvisation, where you're just jamming around and using those tools. We kind of defined that a little bit better and touched on some subjects as far as improvisation that will actually lead into composition also, and I hope that was enlightening. But today we're going to talk about chordal resolve. I'm going to try to make this as simple as possible with just plain bar chords. We're going to be talking about the key of G. So if we're talking about the key of G, that I'm not going to get too into deep theory, but I got to give you a little bit of theory so you'd understand this. So you've got like the key of G. So the intervals in the G would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Eighth intervals back to G, one octave up. So you'd have G, B, or G, A, B, C, D, E, F sharp, back to G. Alright, and then the basic tonal chords that would be major and minor for that scale are going to be on those intervals. So you'd have G major bar chord, A minor bar chord, B minor bar chord, you'd have C major bar chord, you'd have D major bar chord, and you'd have E minor bar chord. Major, minor, minor, major, major, minor. And then you go to a half diminished. A half diminished would be on the seventh interval of that progression, which would be, it's basically played like, it's the root, it's the flat fifth, it's the flat seventh, and the minor third. So, and that's the leading tone normally leading back into G. So with that basic progression, the basic scale there, and the basic fundamental major and minor tonal chords, we're going to use those to resolve to. That way, sometimes in some of the things we've talked about, in the devices we talked about, that you may not resolve back into key for a while. You might wander around, but to really understand resolving back into the underlying key in one of the chords is really important. So as you're using any of the devices that I've talked about, there's somewhere along the line that you're going to come back into key. And I wanted to give a really good example of that, you know, to show you. And even the three major chords in this scale, you know, if you're playing them open, you've got G open, you've got C open, you've got D open, that most guitarists understand. You've got A minor, E minor, and B minor. Some of those, the fundamental major and minor chords, and the half diminished, that is a kind of off the wall chord, depending on how advanced you are as a guitarist, but you might not use it a lot at first. But anyway, let's talk about resolving back into the structure of the scale. Because remember we talked about moving the chordal progression forward, meaning using one of the notes in G as the leading tone, moving up to somewhere else, and then using that note to form a new chord, which is fine. You can keep going and going and going like that, but eventually you're more than likely to bring some closure to whatever you're doing. You're going to want to resolve back into key. So somewhere along the line, let's just give an example. An example of this is, you understand the major and minor tonal chords of the scale of G. G major, A minor, B minor, D major, or C major, D major, and E minor. We won't even talk about the seventh half diminished. So those 6 chords, right? So if we start out in G, and we decide that, you know, we're going to use either one of the devices I talked about, or just search around, and I decide to go to D flat diminished. Now the key to that is, now I can go from that D flat diminished up to a D augmented, but sometime I'm going to want to resolve that back into key, so it sounds like it has some closure. And some resolves sound open, sound like they don't have a good closure, that it's still kind of hanging, and some of them have real good closure. Like if you go to the 6th interval, which would be this E minor, it's going to sound like it doesn't have a really good closure, as it would if you went to like G. And I'll show you, because if I go G to that D flat diminished, to that D augmented, to this E minor, you kind of hear the sound of that, right? How it sounds like it's resolved, but it's still kind of hanging. But the difference when it comes back to G, the resolved sound it has, or even to A minor, it has a totally different texture, like it's leading on. Does that make sense? So the answer is that the really simple device that is of resolve is that you're wandering out of the key. That diminished chord and that augmented chord are obviously not in the key of G, right? But I resolved it back to one of the tonal chords in that key, one of the simple primary major or minor tonal chords of that key. And it's not that difficult. There's 3 major and 3 minor. Good to go, dude, and you learn a half diminished. You're good to go. You play all over the fretboard, whether it's in any key, right? Okay, so now you're wandering around and using these other chords. And the understanding of that, there is all kinds of theory about resolving to what interval and what that means, and all kinds of crap that you can get lost in for days. The biggest thing is, how does it feel? How does it sound? Because if I go that G to that diminished to that augmented, and then I resolve to that A, how does that feel to me? How does that feel? Where does that mic gonna lead me? Or if I do that and I resolve to this C, how does that feel? It's a different type of resolve. And to understand that the resolve feels different. It sounds different. It feels different. It gives the whole progression a different texture. And you can read about theory until the day you're dead, and you can argue about theory with people all day long on the internet, and everybody, does that make sense? But it's a feeling. The feeling is more important than anything, the feel of the resolve, and where you might be going, because the whole mentality is you might play this, and go to that A minor, and that might, the resolve there back into key might sound better to you because of where your mind is thinking about going in the progression. Or the C might sound better, or the E minor might sound better because of where that might lead you. That's one of the key concepts to understand and device to understand, that you don't get so much lost in the theory as the feel of it. Where it might lead you? What sounds better? If I do that, I might even resolve back. I'm at D augmented, but I might resolve to D major. That's part of one of the tonal chords in that scale. Hear the difference of that, because now that I'm playing that on top, I'm playing a D augmented, and then I'm playing a D major over that. That gives a totally different texture and feel of a resolve, and where that might lead you. And depending on whether you're like writing vocals to it, or if you're doing leads above it, doing melody over it, and it gives you a really quick reference in key to help you resolve back into key to help you move forward. Because the whole concept of that is this. First of all, it brings resolve that you've resolved back into the key. Second of all, it opens up some other doors to help you move forward again. So like say you play this G, you go to this D flat diminished, to this D augmented, to this B. Now that brought some resolve back into the key. Then you decide to go to E flat diminished, to E minor. Does that make sense? I hope you can hear this well enough to understand that you can hear the connection of how it's kind of resolving. And the understanding of that is that it really boils down to trying to use it tastefully when you're progressing. The devices that I've tried to teach you and show you that weren't really super theory, they're abstract theory. Abstract theory normally means it's really hard to write how the color blue looks to somebody who's blind. It's really hard to explain to somebody who can't taste what chocolate ice cream tastes like if it's done well, right? So, I mean, it's abstract theory, and basically abstract theory is trying to relay something or impart some kind of feeling or texture, musical texture to somebody, is that type of thing. Trying to explain blue to a blind person. And you're going to come up with abstract theory trying to explain that to them that may not be real theoretical. Does that make sense? Which is what most abstract theory is, but a lot of abstract theory is very helpful to beginner, intermediate people, and especially advanced people when they get stuck somewhere and they're like, well, how do I get out of this rut, you know? And it's like, the kind of abstract theory I'm talking about is really helpful. So it's really, no matter where you start, you know, because even if you start at A minor here, and you decide to go to D augmented, and you decide to go back to C, you know, it's a different texture. And the understanding of that as you experiment with that you get different textures that are different types of feelings. I'm not going to get too heavy into that because then we'll get really into music production as far as movie scores and things like that are concerned. And then there's can be a lot of theoretical argument about, you know, what's the best music to play when Jamie's crying. You know what I'm saying? It's like, so that is a huge debate, but some things work really well, some things don't, you know, and that's obvious, you know, if you watched a couple movies. So anyway, that's what I wanted to address today, is the actual resolve of your chordal progression when you're improvising or when you're writing. That way, especially when you're practicing, because using the devices we talked about, you can use all those devices that we've talked about, and one of the biggest things is going to be resolving back into key. into some key. Does that make sense? And G is a prime example. Now you can take that form. That's just the basic, the first, second, third, fourth, fifth, and sixth interval of the G scale, and you can move it anywhere to F, F major, G minor, A minor, A sharp, C, D minor. Does that make sense? Now, and you can move that up and down the fretboard anyway. You can find the open chords if you want, but it's really good to practice that, because understanding your bar chords there really gives you an immediate place to go. Unless you really understand your modes, and you can switch modes really fast in the open position, which is great. You're going to want to learn that eventually. But for a lot of people, that it can be really simple understanding when they start first trying to learn their modes when they're doing lead stuff, you know, in a general area here, you know. So, I mean, the first mode, at least, they got somewhere to go to that really quick, that's, you know, that they don't have to change mode all of a sudden because they're in the initial position of where the key started. Does that make sense? So that's what I wanted to talk about today, is that resolve back to the key. So that any of those devices we talked about will work in the structure, and you also have another device that's resolved back to key. Now, that may sound funny to somebody who understands a little bit of theory, like, duh, you want to resolve back to key. But a lot of beginner or intermediate people, that it doesn't sound stupid, because they don't really understand exactly how to play in key. So, you know, and just getting them to learn the basics, major and minors of a basic key, are very important. So they start to learn the importance of using those devices so they can have fun. You know, they're having fun playing that G, that diminished. They're going to that D major, and then they're going to, I don't know, B flat diminished, back to B minor. You know, and they're experimenting with their chords, and they're experimenting with where they can go, and understanding they can go anywhere. And when they get lost a little bit, like you just took off and you went G, then you went D diminished, and then you went, or D flat diminished, and you went D diminished, and then you went, I don't know, you went to, you know, some kind of half diminished up here, and you're like, well, I'm sounding like I'm way out there, bro. Like, you know, I'm getting lost out here somewhere, and it's not sounding to resolve anywhere. You can really quickly try to find one of the keys of that underlying key that you started in to resolve to. Any one of them. Does that make sense? That way, as you're using some of the devices I talked to you, then it's like, you know, home base. You know, it's like, well, no matter how far off I wander off into diminished or half diminished chords or wherever, you know, using those devices that Doc's talked about, that you can come back to one of those tonal chords, you know, and it's a resolve thing. We keep moving forward with this resolve issue, because the whole resolve issue takes that whole issue out of the problems that you may be having in composition improvising, and helps you focus more on moving forward. That way, you've gone playing that, you're playing that diminished, you're resolved back to that A minor. Now your focus isn't so much on no understanding you need to resolve, but understanding that now you can move forward. Now where are you going to go? You're going to go to E augmented, to D major. Does that make sense? That way, as you're experimenting, then you're playing around, and you start using those other devices, like playing leads on top of wherever you're going, and using the notes in the chord to be the leading tone or the next note in the next chord, or just, you know, playing in key. I mean, you're going G, and then you're going D major, and you're going to A minor. That sounds cool, right? G, D, A minor. And then it's like, well, I might want some flavor. I need to put some other chord in there, go somewhere with that, because it's starting to sound stagnant to get me moving forward. A chord that isn't in key to help you move forward is a very useful tool, because even something like that, with the resolve issue in mind, there's also stepping out of key for a moment to move the progression forward. So you're like playing this G, you're playing this D major, you come down to this A minor, and then to get you going forward, like that's some kind of chorus or something like that, that like even something simple like a B flat diminished to B. got it moving forward. So you're like cruising along. G, D, A minor, B flat diminished to B minor. Does that make sense? Now that chord, I had a thing going, a little progression going that I'd made up using the key, the tonal major and minor chords from that key. And it could have been, and then I used a chord out of key to kind of color it, to help it move into the next tonal progression, or progression. Progression normally, a repeating progression a lot of times in a lot of simpler music. And then I might have been going to B, E minor to D. Does that make sense? Am I going there for a while? Or it could have been a chord, a note out of chord. My progression might have been like G, D flat diminished, D. I might have been writing something like that. And then I might have decided to go to use D flat diminished to go down to as a stepping stone leading towards E minor or leading towards B minor or leaning towards A minor. And you feel the different type of resolve it has going to different chords. But I've resolved back into key. And then I start looking where I'm going from there. Am I going to step out of key again? Or am I going to play some of the tonal chords in key that sound good for whatever I'm trying to do? But it's the resolve thing that you want to get in your head. Resolving back to one of the tonal chords of that scale. In the major scale, pentatonics I'm not going to get into right now. That it's actually seems simpler, but it's a little more difficult to define technically to where it's actually theoretically correct. I mean, I can tell you some abstract theory about it, and you can play rock and blues all day long, but there's no concrete theory there. There never has, and there probably never will be. It's abstract theory most of the time that brings that forward momentum, or they're talking jazz. So anyway, with major scales, and that opens up worlds, because then you're just basically got those tones, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, back to the eighth tone is actually the first tone, 1 octave higher. And the tonal chords in that, major, minor, minor, major, major, minor, and then half diminished is that 7th, leading back into the first tone, which is a major G. And you can move that up and down the fretboard anywhere you want, play an F or G or A or B flat or whatever. Does that make sense? And work with that. Work on your resolve. Work on starting on any one of those chords, like E. I'm going to start in E minor. I'm going to go down to C. I'm going to go to D. Now I'm going to use this diminished. I'm going to use E flat diminished to get back to E. Does that make sense? So it's the resolve thing, and when you step out of key, that can also be a texture to try to help. It's a lot of times it can be looked at like a leading tone, like it's getting boring, and you're trying to use a chord out of key to lead back into key. Does that make sense? But I don't want to get too much in it. That's a whole nother abstract theory concept. I basically wanted to talk more about resolving back to that underlying progression. There's lots of progressions. There's lots of different scales. If you're beginning or intermediate, I suggest you stick with the major scale. The major, or if you can understand a little bit of theory, the relative minor. So if you're talking about the key of G that we were just talking about, its relative minor would be E. And the first, if you look at E, well, I'm not going to get into it. I want to get too much into theory, but there's the relative minor of the major scale, which basically uses the same chords. It uses the same chords as the relative major. But we won't get into that. We wanted to talk about resolve. So that's a huge thing for you as you're practicing the devices we've talked about, is to resolve back to one of the chords that are in this underlying scale. Think you're starting in any scale. A, if you're going to start in A. A, whatever scale you decide to start with, that trying to, as you're moving around and trying other chords, that trying to resolve back to that underlying scale. It brings some closure, like we were talking about in the first video, of resolving back to one of the tonal notes of the underlying chord when you're improvising and playing lead. Remember we were talking about playing that G chord, that G triad, and resolving back to one of the notes that was G, that was B, or D when we're playing lead. Anytime we stop, or we were talking about playing a harmony of that, you can sometimes you can get away with a fourth or a sixth or a flat seventh or something like that. That's a harmony of it. Sometimes you can't stay on it too long. But it's the same kind of concept. So instead of you being playing lead that's resolving back to one of the tonal notes, your rhythms are resolving back to the underlying key to bring some closure that sounds complete, like it's, you know, a little bit more on track. Does that make sense? Like it's just not out in left field somewhere, or right field, or upside down field, or whatever. Does that make sense? And that resolve concept, another addition to the resolve concept that you can apply to your improvising and your writing, and to have fun. That way when you're playing along, that you don't get lost, you understand those basic major, minor tonal chords for just a simple scale, and you can play around that, improvising that all day long and come up with all kinds of stuff. They have for hundreds of years. Hundreds of years they've been coming up with stuff to do with that. I mean, and they're not probably much into that the way things are, and so just have fun. It opens up worlds for you to experiment around in. Just remember to resolve. Peace out, love. Hope you enjoyed this week's video. See you next week.